Thanks, Aidan. Thanks. As Aidan said, it's been now 40 years since I've been in IT, and in fact started in Canberra. So these days I work internationally but live in Canberra. And but this particular presentation, I won't be talking to you about the changes that have happened in that time. We're going to be talking about a much closer period of these last 5 years between these two surveys. So the good bit is we have a baseline now. We have a baseline based on that earlier survey work, and now we can sort of talk about, well, how were things changing then? Now, how are we changing next? What are the things that we sort of need to start to think about? So let's talk about just a quick executive summary about the survey, just some of the key messages, and then we'll start to dig into the individual questions and give you a bit of a sense about the colour and the differences that are starting to come out in the individual questions. But first of all, just a bit of a helicopter view. So this is the methodology for the survey. We went to about 45 different people were surveyed, pretty close to one per agency, but we did double up in some of the bigger agencies, and the idea was to get a spread of agencies across Canberra. This is all Canberra, all federal government in Canberra. So we haven't done ACT here. This is all federal government. And the idea was to get a spread of agencies, but also a spread of job roles. So you can see sort of from the more strategic side, we have CIO and CTO, cloud strategy, business policy work, procurement, and then IT managers and IT architects, but there were specifically people with cloud responsibilities. So all of them, people who were surveyed, we didn't survey them if they had no involvement in cloud. So they had to have some knowledge and involvement in cloud. First of all, just looking at looking back in time at the 2015 survey, this is our baseline, and the key findings that were coming out of the 2015 survey. And it's interesting looking back though in those days, we have really come a long way since then. So in 2015, the key issue that was coming out, which was a bit of a problem, is that we were a market in transition, is what we were calling it. It was really going from emphasising the risks of cloud to starting to emphasise the opportunities. But the opportunities were pretty much phrased all around, it's government policy, therefore we're doing it. So when we ask people what is the most important use case for cloud, it's to meet government policy, right? So it's like we're being told to do it. It was a forced march. We're being told to do it, so therefore we're still a bit worried about the risks. We're still sort of got those lingering concerns, but we know that it's government policy, so off we go. We're going to be into the cloud now. And when we ask people about projections for the use of the cloud, it was, yes, significant growth. What are you going to be doing with cloud? Well, it's dev, test and websites, and we're doing that sort of work now. What are you going to be doing next? Well, we don't know, but we're going to be meeting government policy. All right, so that was the sort of the messages that were coming out at those stage. The key concerns were security, availability, and the concern about not being cloud ready. So that's where we were in those days. So still quite a bit of activity going on in cloud. So it was still a fair bit of experience in cloud, but it was really about dev, test, early days, and lots of lingering concerns. If you come forward now to 2018, it's a very different market. The key message that's coming through in the underlying, pretty much all of the questions in the survey was, we're ready, so let's get on with it. So it's a very much on the front foot, let's keep moving. So from a strategy and policy perspective, we've now moved from awareness of cloud without plans to a purposeful clarity about tactical direction. So the most important things people are talking about today is that how do we get our applications into the cloud? How do we deal with architectural differences? How do we untangle the spaghetti of existing legacy systems? What do we do about all of that? How do we get stuff into the cloud because we know that it's proven, it's able to be used? The key challenges are procurement around OPEX and CAPEX, and I'll deal with that a little bit more in the specific questions. But it's really, in a sense, as we start to move more and more into the cloud, this issue becomes greater. Skills and resourcing came out as a really big issue, and communicating the benefits of cloud. In a sense, where we're sort of our own worst enemies here with cloud, and that there is, from 2015, where there was a lot of discussion in the media about the lingering concerns of cloud, is it secure, all those sorts of things. A lot of those issues have now been dealt with by 2018, but we're not really talking about good news stories, use cases, and communicating the fact that we are there now in many ways. So lots of legacy transition issues. The key strengths is cloud is now seen as more secure, more reliable, enabler of agility, and there is a lot of key strengths seen of cloud in its own right. The challenge, though, is that there's almost no discussion in any of the survey responses that we got about the bigger opportunities of cloud in a business sense. So the discussion was pretty much about technical issues about, yes, we need to get our applications into the cloud, we need to deal with our architectures, but there wasn't much discussion about, well, okay, once we've got there, we can start to do digital differently. We can do business processes differently. All of those sort of business opportunities and policy opportunities are sort of missing at the moment. So that, in a sense, I suppose the bottom line of the survey is, yes, we've had a really big improvements in the last 3 years, and they need to be celebrated. The challenge for us moving forward is to now build on that base and start to think about the linkages between cloud and digital government, and that's our big challenge. Let's start to dig into some of the responses and see how some of those responses provide a bit more light and colour about some of these issues that I've been talking about. So first of all, questions about cloud strategy and direction. So here we're asking about the management issues. So moving away from technical issues, but just management. What are some of the driving things that are driving you into the cloud? And it's interesting that you'll see in the survey responses to come that OPEX was seen as both an opportunity and a challenge. So one of it is better use of the money that we've got and the flexibility that we've got in terms of funding by OPEX-based services. The challenges of dealing with shadow IT. And I've been having a lot of discussions beyond the survey about the additional agility that you get and the ability for IT now to provide services that in the past have been driven under the covers because we had less flexibility in the way that we delivered our services. Applications modernisation is their key. But the interesting thing is government policy is the number 4 issue. Now, that in a sense is a good message because A, it's still up there high, yes, great, but it's not the top issue anymore. It's not this forced march. We're now starting to think about management issues more than just we're required to do so. It's interesting looking down at the bottom issues, what are the things that are not so important? This last one, number 10, equipment depreciation cycles, that in the early days of cloud was one of the big things. Cloud was all about low cost and ways of dealing with sweated assets. You've got this old assets, old iron that you have in your data centre. You don't have CapEx money to replace it, so we just use cloud. So cloud was sort of like the second answer for those who are too poor to buy CapEx, if that makes sense. Now we're seeing a whole lot of other issues are really the big ones, and this is now the bottom one. The interesting thing too is, the bottom one too is the agency's own cloud strategy. The market has moved on from agencies having to require a separate cloud strategy just to drive cloud. Now, agencies are still having cloud strategies, not a problem, that's fine. But it's not the top of mind issue, it's about outcomes as opposed to process and ways of driving people. We don't have to have a strategy that makes people go to the cloud anymore. It's all of these drivers up here that are important. So it's interesting that there's been a real flip from 2015 to 2018 on this particular issue. Then we asked, okay, business reasons. So that was management side of things. What are the business reasons for driving further applications into the cloud? And this was a really interesting one. It's easy. So, as we'll see a little bit more colour on this issue, it's not so easy if you've got tangled applications and all that sort of thing. We're not talking about that. But once you're in the cloud, easy deployment of changes, updates, it's that flexibility. Business reasons also, security gets a big push. Cost is still there. Cost is one of the things we still in there and talking about, but it's these other things that are practical advantages rather than just cloud is cheap. Now, if we look here at the detail, this is the actual responses that people gave. So we gave people, in order to get that previous slide, we asked an open-ended question. So we didn't guide people in any way. And so these are the actual responses that people gave. And it's interesting, the business reasons for going into the cloud, it gives us the independence to increase or decrease our usage, cost-effective, easy to maintain. Down here, interoperability is the biggest benefit, real-time support, improved performance of best-in-class scalability, enhanced security features, ease of deployment. And you can see here, all of these down here is all about this ease of deployment. It just seems to be an issue that's underlying it here. It saves lots of cost in deployment. So it's something in here that once, here we go again, deployment, deployment all the way down there. So it's something about cloud now saying, well, okay, it's not just about the journey of getting there or the fact that you save money by transitioning to cloud. It's that once you're there, life is so much different. And that's the key message that's coming out. Factors in influencing the decision to go to infrastructure as a service. And this is specifically focusing on infrastructure as a service. So, infrastructure as a service, we're now still seeing some of those underlying reasons still there for infrastructure, but improving security is now one of these big things, and it's taken over from cutting costs and responding to government direction. They're still there, still up there high, but when you look at the top 5, improving security is right up there, and then we're now starting to see some business issues starting to creep in once we get down to 4 or 5. So we're now starting to, now the sad bit is when you look down here, supporting innovative business activities is right down at the bottom. So we've sort of got there in terms of looking a little bit beyond just straight costs, but we still haven't really grasped the nettle here on new ways of doing business. Now, in terms of the biggest challenges and impediments for going to infrastructure as a service, I mentioned before, CapEx to OpEx is seen as an advantage and a disadvantage, and this is the big challenge that's popping up all the way through the survey. And it's sort of understandable in a way, because we're now seeing that once agencies are moving from a little bit of cloud to a whole lot of cloud, we've started to soak up available OpEx, and now we're having to start to think about redoing budgeting and how we do our ways of gaining money internally within the department, because cloud is now starting to become the dominant way of doing things. So now this is really starting to bite, this question of CapEx and OpEx. Skills, turning up there, skills I mentioned is a significant issue, and concerns about reliability and outages. Again, that's an interesting one because we see that coming through also as an advantage if you pick the right supplier. And I'll show you some examples where those have actually come through in the exact words. Complexity of procurement process, about a middle order issue in there. Okay, so the overall impression of cloud services, you know, what do we think are the key issues for overall driving cloud? We asked people, again, a free text question. What sort of advice would you give to people about cloud? If they were going on a cloud journey, what are the sorts of things that other departments need to think about? And that's the sort of thing we asked. And this is interesting. It's about get your training right, which is your staff skillings right, pick the right people with experience and get some experience. Think about security and strategy, understand and get the right vendor. So, again, let's go down to the exact words and see the sorts of things that people are saying. So what advice would you give? Choose your vendor wisely, as this will affect your deployment and support. I thought this was an interesting one. Cloud is a blessing for our organisation. Isn't that nice? Yeah, so cloud is a blessing if it is administered the right way. Make sure your strategy contains broad network access. Here we have a whole lot of stuff around this effective planning and deployment. And you should be open to suggestions and change continuously to improve the setup and the way that you're doing things. Here we go, properly train your staff and plan thoroughly before migrating. So you can see there, for those of you who participated in the survey, all of these are of course anonymous. I have no idea who said what, but you may find some of those responses that you gave in there. Perceptions about cloud providers. And this is, I suppose, where the rubber meets the road. And so we said, this is again a fairly an open-ended question. And we said, well, tell us, we didn't say ask, what do you think about providers, but tell us the providers where you're now allocating a substantial amount of your processing. And it's interesting, we have two clear groupings. There is one is the big name large providers, AWS and Microsoft with Azure. And so they have a big place in the market right now. And then we have the next group here who still have a substantial hold on the cloud in government, which is Google, IBM Cloud and Macquarie Government. So we're seeing here Macquarie as a local provider right up there in that middle tier, and then you see it just drops off to nothing. So we've really got two quite different groupings, and it may be related to the business proposition here that's being put forward. But we have this grouping here and this grouping here. So then we asked about your most recent cloud implementation. How did it go? Was it easier than expected or was it harder than expected? And here's sort of some good news and bad news. So the good news is 44% of people said it was as expected. So that's great news. Only 20% though said it was easier than expected, and a massive 36% said harder than expected. So we've sort of got this dichotomy here of those who did pretty okay, pretty happy with what's going on, and then these who are not. And so why is this happening? The next question we asked is, in migrating to cloud, what are the nature of the difficulties? So there's underestimating the cost, and I dug more deeply into that. And in a sense, it's trying to, very little of it relates specifically to the unit cost of cloud. So unit cost of cloud, people got a pretty good handle on that, but it's on the expenditure and on the business side of how do you manage usage? How do you, a number of organisations I spoke to have really good procedures for commissioning new servers and getting more work, but they forget to decommission. So when the workload goes down, they forget how to drop the workload. They just keep on increasing the workload. So the cost overrun is mainly related, in the discussions I've been having, to procedures and thinking about doing business differently because of the cloud, rather than something inherent in cloud itself. Project complexity is all about transition and architecture. This is about the complexity that we're now starting to see through people with legacy systems and legacy architectures that are all connected up in a spaghetti sort of way. And the sorts of things that are now starting to happen with a small number of providers, and Macquarie is one of them, where we're now starting to see solutions where there is hosting and cloud being able to be provided together, so that you've got at least a way of, within the one security envelope, being able to do both work, so you can transition a little bit more. Those who aren't doing that sort of approach are now discovering that you have network latency as you have your legacy systems over here, and every once in a while when you call an API, because you're still deeply connected into your other systems, as soon as you do that API call, you go out over the network and having to call the cloud people. So where you're managing to get them together with a solution seems to be a better approach for this particular issue as we move into cloud. Transition delays, and generally I've discovered this is largely about planning, which has come out in other parts of the survey. That those who didn't plan well and those who didn't get their skills right have found some difficulties here, but this is all about doing proper planning and proper skills. We know what we need to do. This is a question about doing it. And difficulties in finalising contract terms. This is mainly related, I've found, to those vendors who have less flexible contracts and trying to match up changing government business requirements to fixed contracts that are more difficult. So they're having to deal with some of those sorts of issues. So the investment in cloud, now really seeing that as not too many people at the high end in using cloud. We're somewhere around that 20 to 60% seems to be about the sweet spot for government right now. Nobody in the survey responses were down low or zero. Everyone we surveyed has some work in the cloud, and we're up in decent numbers now for people who are doing work in the cloud. The challenge is we don't have too many right up here. And that's where this OPEX, CAPEX starts to bite. This is where the architectural issues start to bite, and that's where we need to start to think about the skills issues as well, once we start to get up into those higher numbers. And that, I see, is where our challenge is for the coming years, because we've got this bit and we know how to do this bit. We need to learn how to do this bit. Whoops. So the key message about cloud readiness is essentially we're ready. We need to start to think about, we're ready, and our outsourcing vendor has done a fantastic job, is two quotes that have come up. This is the slide that stands out most starkly against the 2015 survey. This slide would not have worked at all in 2015. Some of the words that are coming through, again, these are all the detailed responses. Look, here we are, all in readiness. We're all prepared, ready to migrate to the cloud. The outsourcing vendor has done a fantastic job. We believe we are ready to accept and adopt the latest innovations in cloud setup. We're ready for cloud adoption. I'm sure about our cloud competencies, which is an interesting thing. Or we're on par with our competitors. So we're now really thinking, here we go, I think we're ready. Complete migration is coming up in the coming years. So we're really sort of at this point now, whereas in 2015, it was, I'm not really sure about this cloud stuff, but yes, we're doing it, it's a requirement, to now we've got the basics right, we know what we're doing, we're prepared, now let's just get on and do it. Cloud workloads, if we start to look at cloud workloads, again, the key issues for selecting a cloud provider is the support that they provide and that they're an experienced provider. Cost is still an issue there. Cost is always an issue. But it's interesting to see that cost is no longer the dominating factor. Service, reliability, security, a genuine provider rather than just saying lots of good things, and an experienced provider who knows something about government is some of the things that we're really starting to see through. So again, these are not just my words. We ask people to sort of give a word, and so we can sort of see here, compliant, committed, genuine really came through. Security really came through as a big issue. You can see it all there. Reliability came up a lot. Support, quality of support. Now this is interesting. Trustworthy. Quite a number of sort of started to talk about trust. So there are sort of some things that are now starting to come through as issues for selecting a cloud vendor that are not just your normal procurement issues. And that's one of our big challenges now as we start to think about cloud, is that procurement processes need to start to change, but also some of the things that are important to us need to start to think about them being a little bit different. Workloads for the next 12 months, and this is our last bit, is looking for the future. What are the sorts of things now from 2018 on, compared to the previous survey? From 2018 on, what are we now starting to think about? So, okay, so test dev is still something people are thinking about and is still a dominating issue, but this is the big one, transfer of legacy applications. This is the one where we're really focusing on it. But it's interesting that cloud native applications and hybrid work is also featuring big. So this is sort of the bundle that we're now trying to deal with as the key issues for cloud coming into the future. This one's always been with us and will continue to be with us, but this is where the big changes happened. We're now looking at both new stuff coming uniquely in the cloud and stuff that's transferring legacy stuff and trying to unpick all of that stuff in the past. So the quick summary then, in the 2015 survey, the key issues is, well, we're here, we're doing it because it's government policy, so all right, bit of a forced march. Key challenges, we're not completely convinced about cloud, and the key strength in 2015 was well, at least the procurement procedures are in place and we can buy cloud. We know how to buy cloud. We can do it, but we're not particularly convinced about it. Coming to 2018, the key policy and strategy issues is, well, we're ready, so let's do it. Let's get on with it. The key challenges is that we're really focusing on practical implementation issues as opposed to thinking about things that are bigger. What are the bigger advantages once we're in cloud? The key strengths now is that cloud is proven. Security is almost becoming a thing where it's being pretty well accepted that cloud is more secure in lots of ways. Cloud is more reliable and more functional. We just have to manage the transition to get there. So, in summary, a lot of progress since 2015, but the majority of the focus has been operational. It's about getting there. Our big challenge from 2018 on is to now put that in a much bigger context. Thank you. The thing that surprised me, I think, it wasn't something that I didn't expect, but I was surprised at how glaringly obvious it was in the survey results. That when I am giving presentations and some of the mentoring work I'm doing in government here in Canberra these days, a lot of it is about driving change, and a lot of it is about setting up both IT and our relationships with the business about how do we start to think about IT differently. And the thing that surprised me in the survey results is there is at the moment a bit of a disconnect between that work that's going on and some of the cloud work that's going on, that it's almost like we're still thinking a little bit about cloud as being, well, it's about virtualization, it's about IT, and it's about things that we talk about internally within IT, as opposed to this bigger discussion that we're having elsewhere in the enterprise, where we're talking about bigger issues. Cloud is sort of still compartmentalised a bit off to the side. In terms of things that are happening in other enterprise, in other sectors, it's very sector specific. I've been doing some discussions in the banking sector, for instance, and in retail, and they are just two sectors that are being pummeled in a business sense. They're just, it's not about business transformation, it's about disruption in those markets. And they're just finding that cloud is not an option, it's not something we need to think about, it's a business necessity, because there's no way that we can move in the sort of ways that we need to. I was speaking to one company a few months ago who's born in the internet, so it's one of these tech businesses that comes out of social and the like. And their whole business model is that they start up initiatives within their company, wind them up and wind them down or sell them off if they're not working. And so they've taken the whole cloud way of thinking into their entire business model for the company. So everything is OPEX, everything is as a service. And one of the fellows said that we start up an initiative as a new business venture. If it doesn't fire and we find it should be somewhere else, we just cut it adrift and sell it. And it literally is a book entry because everything is compartmentalised. We don't have to worry about disentangling the organisation. So they are probably the ultimate in flexibility as an organisation. And yet we're sort of still struggling in a sense to try and understand that cloud could be an enabler for more agile government.
What would you do?
Yeah, it was interesting that after having done the work, I went back to the DTA's recent document, the cloud strategy, and the sort of change of tone that is in that document is very consistent with the challenges that we've got going forward here. That I think in a sense DTA's really got it right in terms of the big challenges are now to start to think beyond mechanics and to start to think about cloud as this is the way we do things. Don't even argue about it. That argument's dead. Cloud is the way to do it so that we can become more agile, so that we can do these things and focus on where we need to be. So I think the challenge for DTA is in a sense that the document is right, but winning hearts and minds for the content of the document is going to be the hard bit. And it's very consistent with the message that I've been getting elsewhere beyond the cloud discussion, is that the most popular presentation that I've given in the last 12 months is about cultural change within government. How do you drive cultural change within IT? How do you drive cultural change across the enterprise to start to think about IT differently? And it's about winning hearts and minds for that bigger agenda is the hard bit. That's the hard yards. Log in and do your work. Yeah. I think that's a good point that you raise, because if you look at the 2015 survey, it's interesting that, and compare that with some of the government strategy and policy, some of the whole of government policy documents that were coming out at that stage. It was all about procurement, it was all about panels, it was all about, in a sense, you could sort of compare it to a bit of a military model. Someone centrally was playing the music and everyone was marching to the music sort of thing. Now, if you look at the recent document that came out of DTA, where there's a bit more emphasis now on doing risk management within the agency and now starting to free up some of those things so that not everyone has to be in lockstep. So the challenge I think you've identified is exactly right, that in the past we've sort of looked to a central agency for a list and saying, well, okay, that's the way we do things. Today, in terms of doing software as a service, the list is far too big and the list keeps on changing. And the discussions that I've been having within a number of agencies now has been about, in a software sense, has been about agreeing common platforms and sticking rigidly by that and finding then ways on top of those platforms, those software platforms, to then become far more innovative and agile and go with the market. So it's now about moving away from the lockstep approach to now starting to think about, well, we need to internally have a risk-managed approach. We internally need to start to think about how do we evaluate what is good on the cloud and what is not, and how do we move on, as opposed to waiting for the central agencies to come up with the definitive list on everything. And by the time they come up with it, it's out of date. And that's our big challenge, because it's a completely different mindset. And then, of course, I think one of my very early slides was talking about, well, one of the big advantages of cloud is it gets away from the shadow IT sort of sense. So in one of the problems we have in government right now is that we have, in an IT sense, where we're waiting for the central agencies, we're waiting for processes, we're sort of waiting for the lockstep march. Then the business areas, quite independently, have been going with their credit card and they've been saying, well, I'll have one of them and I'll have one of them. And so the challenge is, how do we make those two come together a bit more? Because we can't have this and we can't have that. So we've got to somehow bring that agility of thinking and ways of engaging with the business of government in a more agile way, rather than just waiting on an answer. Yes, it is, and it's a tough one. I don't want to minimise the difficulty around this one. And some countries are doing it now. It's interesting. New Zealand has an interesting model where they've got a sort of a halfway sort of point where they're sort of saying, well, okay, we still have government budgeting, where the government budget comes out with CapEx and OpEx and all that sort of stuff. But you can literally turn up to the central agency as if it were an auto teller, in a sense, and say, I've got this much CapEx and I'd like to turn it into this much OpEx. And there's sort of a bit of shuffling that's done on the way in a pragmatic sort of sense, as opposed to here in many other countries, who you can move it, but it involves a bit more stuff. So the challenge is that it's doable and it's fine when cloud is a minimum of what you're doing. Once it becomes the majority of what you're doing, you now need to start to think about this in a much more structured way, and you need better facilities for doing it. You can't just do it as an internal shuffle of funds, because the majority of your funds need to start to come out as OpEx. So yes, absolutely, there needs to be some process and leadership here, and I wouldn't minimise the difficulty of trying to get there. It's going to be a tough one to crack. So for those didn't hear it, is that at the middle manager level, we have some discussions and job processes that are still sort of a bit rooted in the 1990s discussion about IT outsourcing, the forced march of IT outsourcing. And is cloud just one of those that'll either just keep your head ducked down, it'll blow over, or it's something that's it's all going to go bad, that sort of thing. And yes, that's absolutely true. That's happening. And in a sense, it's sort of unfortunate that outsourcing era was a bad experience for many people, and yet an as a service model is not really that. And we need to start to think again about, well, okay, if we're not in a forced march into a particular way of doing it, but we have these tools that allow a whole lot of flexibility, how might we do it, as opposed to this is going to wash over us and just keep your head low and we'll be all right in 5 years' time, or it'll all fall to bits and we'll just let it go. Because it's really clear now that the big message from the first survey to the second is that cloud is not going away. It's continued to grow and has continued to mature. And on top of the 2015 survey, where the predominant message was the government's telling us to do it, we don't really believe it, really the 2018 survey has moved on completely from that. But a lot of the people haven't. Yeah.